On February 25, 1957, a young man named Frederick Benosis walked through the woods near Susquehanna Road in Philadelphia, chasing after a rabbit he hoped to trap. The air was cold that morning, the kind of cold that settles into your bones and makes you question why you left the warmth of your home. Frederick moved through the underbrush, his eyes scanning the ground for signs of his prey, when something stopped him, dead in his tracks. There, discarded among the winter debris like yesterday's garbage, sat a cardboard box. But this was no ordinary box. It was a bassinet box, the kind you'd buy at JCPenney to cradle a newborn baby. And inside that box, wrapped in a plaid flannel blanket, lay the naked body of a little boy. I want you to pause for just a moment and really picture this scene. A child, no more than 4 to 6 years old, with blonde hair that had been recently cut, perhaps by someone who didn't know what they were doing. His body bore the marks of profound neglect and unspeakable violence. Bruises covered his small frame. His fingertips were wrinkled, pruned, as if he'd been submerged in water. And his eyes, those innocent eyes that should have been filled with wonder and joy, were closed forever. Frederick Benosis ran. He ran from those woods, and for reasons that haunt the conscience, he told no one what he'd found. Perhaps he was afraid. Perhaps he didn't want to get involved. But that little boy remained in his cardboard coffin for several more days, alone in the cold, waiting for someone brave enough to give him a voice. A few days later, a young college student named Frank Guthrum was driving down Susquehanna Road when he spotted the box. Unlike Frederick, Frank stopped. Unlike Frederick, Frank looked inside. And unlike Frederick, Frank made the call that would launch what would become the longest-running cold case in Philadelphia history. This is the story of the boy in the box. This is the story of America's unknown child. And this is the story of how it took 65 years, an army of dedicated investigators, and the relentless march of science to finally give this little boy what he deserved all along: his name. But I need you to understand something before we go any further. This isn't just a story about a crime. This is a story about identity, about the fundamental human need to be known, to be remembered, to matter. For 65 years, this child existed only as a question mark, a symbol of our collective failure to protect the most vulnerable among us. And the answer to that question, when it finally came, would shake the very foundations of everyone who thought they knew this case. Now, if you're watching this, I need to ask you something. There are children right now at this very moment who are suffering in silence, whose names we don't know, whose pain goes unseen. If this story moves you, if you believe that every child deserves to be known and protected, then share this video. Subscribe to this channel. Because the only way we shine light into the darkest corners of our society is by refusing to look away. Don't scroll past this story. Stay with me until the end, because what happens in the final chapter will change everything you thought you knew. Let me take you back to that crime scene, to those cold winter woods in Fox Chase, Philadelphia. When police arrived, they found a scene that raised more questions than answers. The box itself was a JCPenney bassinet box, the kind used to ship a portable crib. Inside, wrapped around the boy's battered body, was a cheap plaid blanket with a unique design pattern. The boy was completely naked, his body showing signs of severe malnutrition. He was small for his estimated age, perhaps only 30 to 40 pounds, the weight of a child, half his years. The medical examiner's report painted a picture of horror. The child had been beaten to death, suffering multiple blows to the head. There were older scars on his body, evidence that the abuse hadn't been a single incident but a sustained campaign of cruelty. His hair had been crudely cut, with clumps of it found clinging to his body, suggesting the haircut had happened shortly before or even after death. Most disturbing of all, his body showed signs of being cleaned, as if someone had tried to wash away the evidence of their crime. But here's what kept investigators awake at night. No one had reported this child missing. In a city of 2 million people, in a country that prided itself on protecting its children, not a single person came forward to claim this little boy. No mother cried on the evening news. No father pleaded for information. No grandparent recognized that those features that should have been familiar to someone. Detective Remington Bristow was one of the first investigators assigned to the case, and he would dedicate the rest of his life to solving it. Standing over that small body in the medical examiner's office, Bristow made a silent promise. He would find out who this boy was, he would find out who did this to him, and he would make sure that justice, however delayed, would eventually be served. The Philadelphia Police Department launched one of the largest investigations in the city's history. They distributed thousands of flyers featuring a photograph of the boy, his eyes digitally opened to make him appear merely sleeping. They showed the blanket to textile experts, traced the box to every JCPenney store in the region, and interviewed hundreds of potential witnesses. They followed every lead, no matter how small or how strange, and the leads came pouring in. Tips flooded the department, each one promising to be the breakthrough they needed. But one by one, they all led to dead ends. The boy remained nameless, his killer remained free, and the case grew cold. What none of them could have known, standing in those freezing woods in 1957, was that the answer to this mystery was hiding in plain sight. The truth was closer than anyone imagined, tucked away in a quiet house, not far from where the body was found. And it would take more than 6 decades, a revolution in forensic science, and a team of investigators who refused to give up for that truth to finally emerge. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand how this case was finally solved, we need to understand the world in which this child lived and died. We need to go back to 1950s America, to a time when children were seen and not heard, when family secrets stayed buried, and when a little boy could disappear without anyone asking where he went. The Philadelphia of 1957 was a city of contradictions. On the surface, it was experiencing the post-war boom that defined the era. Families were moving to the suburbs, buying their first televisions, living the American dream. But beneath that glossy surface lurked a darker reality. Child abuse was rarely discussed. Mental illness was hidden away, and institutions meant to protect children often did anything but. The woods where the boy was found were part of this contradiction. Fox Chase was a working-class neighborhood, the kind of place where people minded their own business and didn't ask too many questions. The dump site was secluded but not remote, accessible but not obvious. Whoever left that box knew the area. Whoever left that child was comfortable enough to make multiple trips, confident enough to believe they would never be caught. And for 65 years, they were right. Detective Bristow understood early on that solving this case would require more than traditional police work. He became a man possessed, spending his own money, using his vacation days, and eventually continuing the investigation even after his retirement. He would later say that the boy in the box haunted him, that he saw that small face in his dreams, that he couldn't rest while the child remained unknown. Bristow developed several theories over the years, each one more disturbing than the last. One theory centered on a foster home near the dump site, run by a man with a criminal record. Another focused on a traveling carnival that had passed through the area around the time of death. A third, perhaps the most heartbreaking, suggested the boy had been sold by his biological parents to people who promised him a better life. But the theory that gained the most traction, the one that seemed to fit the evidence best, centered on a young woman who came forward in 2002 with a story that chilled investigators to the bone. This woman, known only as Martha, claimed she knew exactly who the boy in the box was and exactly what had happened to him. According to Martha, her mother had purchased the boy from his biological parents in the summer of 1954. He was a sickly child, unwanted and unloved, sold for the price of a few dollars. Martha's mother, a violent and mentally unstable woman, had subjected the boy to years of horrific abuse. The night he died, Martha claimed, he had vomited in the bathtub and her mother had slammed his head against the floor in a fit of rage. It was Martha's mother who had cut his hair, trying to disguise him. It was Martha's mother who had cleaned his body and placed him in that box. And it was Martha, just a child herself at the time, who had been forced to help dispose of the evidence. The story was compelling, detailed, and absolutely unverifiable. Martha's mother had died years earlier. There were no records of the sale, no witnesses to corroborate her claims, no physical evidence linking her family to the crime. Investigators were left with an agonizing choice: believe a story they couldn't prove, or continue searching for an answer that might never come. They chose to keep searching. I want you to understand something about Philadelphia and its relationship with the boy in the box. This case didn't just affect the detectives who worked it. It seeped into the collective consciousness of an entire city, becoming part of the urban folklore. A ghost story told in hushed tones, a wound that never quite healed. In the days following the discovery, newspapers across the country ran the story of the unknown child. The photograph of the boy, his hair neatly combed, his eyes appearing peacefully closed, stared out from front pages and television screens. People were horrified, not just by the crime itself, but by the anonymity of the victim. In a society that prided itself on knowing its neighbors, on looking after its own, how could a child simply cease to exist without anyone noticing? The Philadelphia Police Department received over 10,000 tips in the first month alone. People called in from across the country, convinced they recognized the boy from their neighborhood, their church, their local playground. Each tip was dutifully investigated. Each investigation led nowhere. Officer Joseph McGillen was a young patrolman when the body was discovered, and he never forgot the sight of that small form in the medical examiner's office. Years later, after rising through the ranks to become a homicide detective, McGillen would request the case file and spend countless hours reviewing evidence that had already been reviewed 1,000 times before. There's a phenomenon in law enforcement called the case that won't let you go. Every veteran detective has one, a case that haunts their dreams. that draws them back again and again, that refuses to stay closed, even when all reasonable leads have been exhausted. For multiple generations of Philadelphia detectives, the boy in the box was that case. But it wasn't just law enforcement who couldn't let go. In 1998, a group of concerned citizens formed the Vidocq Society, named after a famous French detective. This organization, composed of forensic experts, profilers, and retired law enforcement officers, took on cold cases that seemed unsolvable. The boy in the box was among their first. The Vidocq Society brought fresh eyes and new techniques to the investigation. They created a psychological profile of the likely perpetrator, studied the textile patterns on the blanket, and analyzed the cardboard box with technology that hadn't existed in 1957. And they also commissioned a forensic sculptor to create a bust of the boy, a three-dimensional representation of what he might have looked like in life. That bust became a powerful symbol of the search for justice. Unlike the police photograph which showed a child in death, the sculpture showed a living boy with a hint of a smile and curious eyes. It humanized him in a way that the official images never could, reminding everyone who saw it that this was once a real child with hopes, fears, and dreams. The sculpture was displayed at press conferences, at missing children events, and eventually at the grave site itself. Because yes, the boy in the box was buried, even though no one knew his name. In fact, he was buried multiple times. The first burial took place in Potter's Field, the city's cemetery for the unknown and unclaimed. It was a simple affair attended only by a few police officers and medical examiner staff. The boy was given no name, no gravestone, no marker to indicate that he had ever existed. This troubled Remington Bristow deeply. He felt that the boy deserved better, that even in death this child should be treated with dignity. So Bristow began a campaign to have the body exhumed and reburied in a proper cemetery with a proper marker. It took years of lobbying, of pushing against bureaucratic resistance. But in 1998, Bristow finally succeeded. The second burial took place at Ivy Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia, in a plot donated by the cemetery's owners. This time, the boy was given a headstone inscribed with the words, "America's Unknown Child." A bronze plaque featured the forensic sculptor's image of the boy, along with the dates of his discovery and reburial. And this time hundreds of people attended, complete strangers who had been moved by the story and wanted to pay their respects. I want you to think about that for a moment. Hundreds of people, none of whom had ever met this child, standing in a cemetery to mourn someone they knew only from newspaper articles and police photographs. What does that tell us about the human capacity for empathy? What does it say about our need to bear witness, to acknowledge suffering, to refuse to let the forgotten stay forgotten? Detective Bristow died in 1993, 5 years before the reburial he had fought so hard to achieve. He never learned the boy's name, never saw anyone brought to justice, never fulfilled the promise he had made standing over that small body in 1957. But his work would prove essential to everything that came after. Before he died, Bristow had insisted on preserving biological evidence from the case, a decision that was unusual for the time, but would prove crucial decades later. He had also meticulously documented every lead, every theory, every piece of evidence, creating an archive that would guide future investigators. What Bristow couldn't have anticipated was the revolution in forensic science that was just beginning. DNA technology, genetic genealogy, advanced isotopic analysis. Techniques that would have seemed like science fiction in 1957 were about to transform cold case investigations, and the boy in the box would become one of their greatest success stories. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Before we reach that breakthrough, we need to understand the decades of frustration, of false leads and dashed hopes that preceded it. We need to walk through the theories that seemed so promising but led nowhere. The witnesses who came forward with stories that couldn't be verified. The moments when it seemed like the case would never be solved. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this before you answer. If you had information about a crime, even a crime that happened decades ago, even information that might be incomplete or uncertain, would you come forward? Would you be willing to disrupt your own life, to potentially upend your family, to possibly face skepticism and scrutiny, all for the sake of a child you never knew? I ask because this question lies at the heart of the boy in the box case. Somewhere out there were people who knew the truth. Perhaps they were directly involved. Perhaps they only suspected. Perhaps they had heard rumors or noticed inconsistencies that they never reported. For 65 years, those people kept silent. What would it take for them to speak? What finally breaks through the wall of silence that surrounds cases like this? Is it guilt? Is it the passage of time? Is it the knowledge that the people who might be hurt by the truth are already dead? Leave a comment below and tell me what you think. What would it take for you to come forward with information about a decades-old crime? What obligations do we have to the dead and to the living who still seek answers? The 1960s brought a new wave of investigation into the boy in the box case. As the initial publicity faded and public attention moved on to other tragedies, a small group of dedicated investigators continued their work. They had developed several promising theories, and each one seemed to bring them tantalizingly close to the truth. The foster home theory remained the most compelling. Less than 2 miles from the dump site, there was a property that had housed a foster home operation in the 1950s. The home had been run by a man with a history of fraud and child endangerment, and several children had passed through its doors during the years the boy in the box would have been alive. Investigators discovered that a bassinet, similar to the one whose box had become the boy's coffin, had been purchased for this foster home. They found witnesses who remembered seeing a child matching the boy's description on the property. And they uncovered evidence that the foster home had been hastily closed shortly after the body was discovered. But when they dug deeper, the theory fell apart. The bassinet had been sold to someone else. The child witnesses remembered turned out to be accounted for. The closure of the foster home was related to financial problems, not to any crime. Another promising lead had become another dead end. The carnival theory was equally frustrating. In the months before the body was discovered, a traveling carnival had passed through the Fox Chase area. Carnivals in the 1950s were notorious for operating outside the law, for harboring people who were running from their pasts, for the kind of transient lifestyle that made tracking individuals nearly impossible. Investigators found witnesses who claimed to have seen a small blonde boy with carnival workers. They found records suggesting that a child had been traveling with one of the carnival families. They even tracked down several former carnival employees who remembered a boy matching the description. But when they tried to trace these memories to specific individuals, they hit a wall. The carnival workers had scattered across the country. records were incomplete or non-existent. Memories unreliable after so many years contradicted each other. The carnival theory, like the foster home theory, led nowhere. Then there was the theory that the boy had been the victim of an illegal adoption gone wrong. In the 1950s, a black market in babies thrived across America. Desperate parents, unable to have children of their own or seeking to avoid the bureaucracy of official adoption, would pay substantial sums for infants and young children. Sometimes these transactions went smoothly. Sometimes they ended in tragedy. Investigators found evidence that such operations had existed in the Philadelphia area during the time period. They found records of children who had been sold by impoverished parents, only to disappear into foster homes, private adoptions, or worse. But they could never connect these operations to the specific child in the box. Each failed theory took its toll on the investigators. McGillen, who had taken over the case after Bristow's retirement, described the experience as climbing a mountain that keeps getting taller. Every time they thought they were close to the summit, new obstacles appeared. Every time they thought they had found the answer, it dissolved into mist. But McGillen, like Bristow before him, refused to give up. He understood that somewhere buried in the evidence or hidden in the memories of witnesses yet to come forward, the truth was waiting. He just had to find it. The breakthrough, when it finally came, would originate from a direction no one expected. It wouldn't come from traditional detective work or witness testimony. It would come from a laboratory, from scientists who had figured out how to extract secrets from the very molecules of the boy's body. Let me tell you about a revolution that was quietly transforming criminal investigation while the boy in the box lay in his grave at Ivy Hill Cemetery. It began in 1984 when a British scientist named Alec Jeffreys discovered that human DNA contained patterns unique to each individual. This discovery, which Jeffreys initially thought might be useful for studying hereditary diseases, would soon upend everything we knew about identifying the living and the dead. The first criminal case solved through DNA evidence came just 2 years later, when DNA analysis linked a suspect to a series of murders in England. Almost immediately, law enforcement agencies around the world began to see the possibilities. Cold cases that had languished for decades could potentially be reopened. Unknown victims could potentially be identified. Killers who Audrey thought they had gotten away with their crimes could potentially be brought to justice. But DNA analysis had limitations, especially in its early years. It required relatively large, well-preserved samples. It could only identify individuals whose DNA was already in a database, and it was expensive, time-consuming, and often inconclusive. For the boy in the box case, these limitations posed significant challenges. The evidence collected in 1957 had been stored for decades, under conditions that weren't ideal for DNA preservation. There was no database of DNA profiles from the 1950s against which to compare any samples that might be extracted. And even if investigators could obtain usable DNA, they would need something to compare it to. Detective McGillen understood these challenges, but he also understood that science was advancing rapidly. What was impossible today might be routine tomorrow. So he made a decision that would prove crucial. He had the boy's body exhumed once again, this time not for reburial, but for the extraction of biological samples that could be preserved for future testing. The exhumation took place in 1998, the same year as the public reburial at Ivy Hill Cemetery. In fact, the two events were connected. Before the boy could be reburied with dignity, his remains would first be subjected to the most advanced forensic analysis available at the time. Forensic scientists extracted DNA samples from the boy's teeth and bones, the parts of the body most likely to have preserved genetic material after decades of burial. They also took samples for other types of analysis, including isotopic testing that could potentially reveal where the boy had grown up based on the chemical signatures in his bones and teeth. The DNA extraction was successful, but as predicted, there was nothing to compare it to. The National DNA Database, CODIS, had been established just a few years earlier and contained profiles primarily of convicted criminals. The boy in the box's DNA didn't match anyone in the system. Isotopic analysis proved more immediately useful. By analyzing the ratios of certain elements in the boy's remains, scientists could determine what he had eaten and drunk during different periods of his life. These ratios varied by geography, reflecting local water sources and food supplies. The results suggested that the boy had spent most of his short life in the northeastern United States, possibly in the Philadelphia area itself. This was significant because it undermined theories that the boy had been brought to Philadelphia from somewhere else. The carnival theory, which assumed the boy had been traveling with a transient group, seemed less likely. The evidence pointed to someone local, someone who had lived and died within a relatively small geographic area. But isotopic analysis couldn't tell investigators what they most needed to know: the boy's name and the identity of his killer. For that, they would need a breakthrough in DNA technology that was still decades away. That breakthrough came in the form of genetic genealogy, a technique that combined DNA analysis with traditional genealogical research. The principle was simple but revolutionary. Even if a person's DNA wasn't in any criminal database, their relatives' DNA might be in commercial genealogy databases. By finding these relatives and tracing family trees backward, investigators could potentially identify unknown individuals. The technique had been pioneered in the identification of the Golden State Killer. In 2018, investigators had uploaded the killer's DNA profile to a public genealogy database and found distant relatives. By building out family trees and identifying potential suspects, they had eventually zeroed in on Joseph D'Angelo, a former police officer who had committed dozens of rapes and at least 13 murders across California. The Golden State Killer case captured public attention and demonstrated the power of genetic genealogy. Almost immediately, cold case investigators across the country began to see the potential for their own unsolved cases. The boy in the box was a natural candidate. In 2019, the Philadelphia Police Department partnered with the DNA Doe Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to identifying unknown decedents through genetic genealogy. The organization had already identified dozens of previously unknown victims, using a combination of cutting-edge science and old-fashioned detective work. The process began with the extraction of new DNA samples from the evidence preserved in 1998. These samples were processed using the latest technology, which could work with smaller and more degraded material than earlier methods. The resulting DNA profile was uploaded to public genealogy databases, and the search for relatives began. What happened next was a painstaking process that took years. The DNA Doe Project's volunteers many of them genealogists who had become experts at building family trees, sifted through thousands of potential matches. They built trees forward and backward, identifying ancestors, descendants, and collateral relatives. They eliminated branches that couldn't possibly lead to the boy. They focused on families that fit the geographic and temporal profile. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack the size of a continent. The public genealogy databases contained millions of profiles, and each potential match had to be carefully investigated. Many leads proved false. Many promising branches turned out to be unrelated. The work was tedious, frustrating, and often discouraging. But the volunteers persisted, driven by the same impulse that had motivated Detective Bristow decades earlier. The belief that this child deserved to be known, that his life and death should not have been in vain. The breakthrough came in late 2022. After years of searching, the DNA Doe Project's genealogists had narrowed the pool of potential families to a manageable number. Working with Philadelphia police, they began the delicate process of approaching these families, explaining the investigation, and requesting DNA samples for comparison. One of those families agreed to help. The DNA comparison was made. And for the first time in 65 years, investigators knew the name of the boy in the box. His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli, and his story was even more tragic than anyone had imagined. I want you to say his name out loud. Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Go ahead, say it. Let those syllables fill your mouth, roll off your tongue, exist in the air around you. For 65 years, this child had no name. Now he does. And speaking it, acknowledging it, is a form of resurrection. Joseph was born in January 1953 in Philadelphia, the son of a young mother from a troubled family. His early life remains shrouded in mystery, protected by privacy laws and the understandable reluctance of surviving family members to discuss the details. But we know enough to understand that Joseph's short life was marked by suffering from the very beginning. The family into which Joseph was born was dysfunctional in ways that were all too common in 1950s America, but rarely acknowledged publicly. Mental illness, domestic violence, and poverty created an environment where children were at constant risk. Joseph's birth certificate exists, proof that he was once a living, breathing person with a legal identity. But at some point between his birth and his death, Joseph ceased to exist in the eyes of the system. There are no school records for Joseph Zarelli, no medical records, no church records documenting a baptism or any other milestone. It's as if, somewhere along the way, this little boy simply fell through the cracks of society, becoming invisible to all the institutions that should have protected him. Investigators are still piecing together exactly what happened to Joseph during his short life. What they have uncovered suggests a pattern of neglect, abuse, and isolation that escalated over time. Joseph appears to have been hidden away, kept from the outside world, denied the basic human connections that every child needs to thrive. The circumstances of his death remain under investigation. Legally, this is still an active case. Charges could theoretically still be filed if sufficient evidence can be gathered and if any perpetrators are still alive to face justice. But practically, many of the people who knew the truth about Joseph's death are themselves now dead. What we can say with certainty is that Joseph was a victim of the most intimate betrayal, abuse at the hands of those who should have loved and protected him. The evidence of violence on his body, documented so carefully, by the medical examiner in 1957 tells a story of sustained cruelty. The malnutrition speaks to systematic neglect. The crude haircut suggests either an attempt to disguise him or simply a disregard for his dignity even in death. When the identification was announced in December 2022, the news rippled across the country. Media outlets that had covered the case for decades reported on the breakthrough. Social media lit up with reactions as people who had followed the case for years finally learned the name they had been waiting to hear. But alongside the relief was anger. Deep, burning anger at a system that had failed Joseph so completely. How could a child be born, live for 4 years, and die without anyone noticing? How could a family keep a child hidden in plain sight? How could neighbors, teachers, doctors, priests, anyone fail to see that a little boy was in danger? These questions don't have easy answers. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about our society, about the ways we look away from suffering that's happening right next door, about the limits of our institutions and the gaps in our safety nets. The identification of Joseph Zarelli didn't close the case. In many ways, it opened a new chapter of investigation. Police now had a starting point for understanding what had happened to Joseph and who was responsible for his death. They had a family tree to explore, relatives to interview, records to request. They also had a legal obligation to protect the privacy of living family members who were not responsible for Joseph's death. This is one of the most challenging aspects of genetic genealogy investigations. The same techniques that identify victims can also expose family secrets, disrupt relationships, and potentially harm innocent people. The announcement of Joseph's identity was carefully worded to balance transparency with privacy. Police revealed his name but withheld other identifying information about his family. They acknowledged that the investigation was ongoing but did not disclose specific suspects or evidence. They asked for the public's understanding as they continued their work. For some observers, this caution was frustrating. They wanted names. They wanted accountability. They wanted someone to pay for what had been done to Joseph. And they felt that 65 years was long enough to wait for justice. But others understood the complexity of the situation. Justice delayed is not always justice denied. A rushed prosecution that fails is worse than a careful investigation that succeeds. And the rights of the living must be balanced against the claims of the dead. What everyone could agree on was that Joseph's identification was a victory, incomplete, but real. After 65 years as America's unknown child, Joseph finally had his name back. His grave could be updated to reflect who he really was. His story could be told in full, not as a mystery, but as a tragedy with a beginning, middle, and end. The announcement also brought renewed attention to cold cases across the country. If the boy in the box could be identified after 65 years, what other cases might be solved through genetic genealogy? How many other unknown victims were waiting to be named? The DNA Doe Project and similar organizations saw a surge in donations and volunteers following Joseph's identification. Other police departments reached out to learn from the Philadelphia investigation. The case became a model for how persistence, technology, and collaboration could achieve what had once seemed impossible. But for those closest to the case, the identification brought a more personal form of closure. The descendants of Remington Bristow, the detective, who had dedicated his life to solving the mystery, were present when the announcement was made. They spoke of their ancestors' dedication, of his refusal to give up, of the promise he had made standing over that small body in 1957. Bristow had kept that promise, even if he hadn't lived to see it fulfilled. The work he had done, the evidence he had preserved, the foundation he had built, had all contributed to the breakthrough. In a very real sense, Bristow had solved the case. It had just taken a few more decades for the rest of the world to catch up. The identification of Joseph Zarelli forced a family to confront a secret that had been buried for more than 6 decades. I want to be careful here because I'm talking about real people who are still alive, people who were themselves children when Joseph died, people who may have been victims of the same circumstances that killed their relative. When genetic genealogy reveals the identity of a crime victim, it doesn't just affect the dead. It reverberates through generations, touching people who may have had no knowledge of the crime, no involvement in it, and no desire to be connected to it publicly. These people have rights too. They deserve compassion and understanding, not automatic condemnation. What we know about Joseph's family is limited by both legal restrictions and ethical considerations. But we can speak in general terms about what happens when a family secret of this magnitude is finally exposed. Imagine growing up knowing, or at least suspecting, that something terrible happened in your family's past. Maybe you overheard whispered conversations that stopped when you entered the room. Maybe you noticed gaps in the family photos, periods that were never discussed. Maybe you sensed that there was a story you were never supposed to hear. Now imagine that story becoming front-page news. Imagine journalists and amateur investigators digging into your family history, knocking on doors, calling relatives, posting speculation on social media. Imagine trying to go about your daily life while the name you share with a murder victim trends on Twitter. This is the reality that Joseph's extended family faced in December 2022. Some family members had known the truth, or at least suspected it, for years. Others learned for the first time that they were related to America's unknown child. All of them had to grapple with what that connection meant for their own identity, their own sense of self, their own understanding of their family. The psychology of inherited trauma is complex and still not fully understood. We know that trauma can be passed down through generations, affecting people who never directly experienced the traumatic events. We know that family secrets create patterns of silence and avoidance that can persist long after the original secret keepers are dead. We know that confronting these secrets can be painful, but it can also be liberating. For the Zarelli family, the identification of Joseph must have been both painful because it brought renewed attention to a terrible crime, liberating because the burden of secrecy carried for so long was finally lifted. Whatever they knew or didn't know, suspected or didn't suspect, the truth was now public. They could stop hiding and start healing. The police investigation into Joseph's death necessarily involved extensive contact with his family. Detectives conducted interviews, reviewed documents, and gathered information that could help them understand what had happened in 1957. These conversations must have been extraordinarily difficult for everyone involved. But out of this difficulty came clarity. Investigators were able to piece together a more complete picture of Joseph's life and death. They identified potential suspects, some of whom were still alive, They gathered evidence that could potentially support criminal charges. And they began the long process of determining whether justice was still possible after so many years. The statute of limitations is a legal concept that limits how long prosecutors have to bring charges after a crime. For most crimes, this period is measured in years, sometimes decades. But for murder, there is typically no statute of limitations. A killer can be prosecuted for their crime, regardless of how much time has passed. In practice, however, bringing a 65-year-old murder case to trial poses enormous challenges. Witnesses have died or become unreliable. Evidence has degraded or been lost. The perpetrators themselves may have died or become incompetent. And even if a prosecution is technically possible, it may not be practically feasible. For Joseph's case, these practical challenges loomed large. Then the investigation was still ongoing as of the public announcement, and police officials were careful not to discuss specific suspects or evidence. But the reality was that anyone who had been an adult in 1957 would now be in their 80s at minimum. Many of the people who might have been responsible for Joseph's death were likely already dead themselves. This raises a difficult question. What is the purpose of justice when the perpetrators are no longer able to be punished? Is identifying a victim and telling their story enough? Does holding the dead accountable serve any meaningful purpose? Or is there value in simply knowing the truth, regardless of what consequences follow? I don't pretend to have easy answers to these questions, but I believe that truth has intrinsic value, independent of its practical consequences. Knowing Joseph's name matters even if no one is ever prosecuted for his murder. Understanding what happened to him matters, even if we can't undo the harm. Telling his story matters, even if it's too late to save him. The family's burden in the end is also our burden. Joseph was our child, America's child, a child who belonged to all of us by virtue of his shared humanity. His suffering was a failure of our society, our institutions, our collective responsibility to protect the vulnerable. And his identification is an opportunity for us to do better, to pay closer attention, to intervene before it's too late for the next Joseph. Let me tell you about the men and women who refused to let Joseph be forgotten. Their dedication to this case spans generations, a relay race of justice, where each runner carried the baton as far as they could before passing it to the next. Remington Bristow started that race in 1957, and he ran it until his death in 1993. For 36 years, Bristow was the boy in the box case, spending his own money on investigations, using his personal time to chase leads, keeping the file on his desk long after it had been officially relegated to cold case status. Bristow was a complicated man. Colleagues described him as obsessive, difficult, sometimes impossible to work with. He clashed with supervisors who wanted him to move on to other cases. He frustrated fellow detectives who thought his persistence was a waste of resources. He alienated family members who felt abandoned while he chased a ghost. But Bristow was also heroic in his own way. He saw something in Joseph's case that others missed, a moral imperative that transcended bureaucratic priorities. He understood that this child's anonymity was an ongoing injustice, that every day that passed without identification was another day of failure, and he refused to accept that failure as inevitable. When Bristow retired in 1980, he didn't stop working the case. He continued to investigate on his own, following leads, interviewing witnesses, updating his files. He became something of a legend in Philadelphia law enforcement circles. The old detective who couldn't let go, who would show up at crime scenes and cold case meetings offering theories and insights. Some of his theories were brilliant. His early suspicion that the boy came from somewhere near the dump site was eventually confirmed by isotopic analysis. His insistence on preserving biological evidence made the eventual DNA identification possible. His meticulous documentation provided a roadmap for investigators who came after him. Other theories were less successful. Bristow became convinced at one point that the foster home near the dump site was responsible, and he spent years trying to prove this connection. When the evidence didn't support his theory, he struggled to let it go. His certainty sometimes outpaced his evidence. But Bristow's mistakes don't diminish his achievement. He kept the case alive during decades when it could easily have been forgotten. He created a foundation of evidence and documentation that future investigators would build upon. And he modeled a kind of dedication that inspired others to follow. After Bristow came William Kelly, Joseph McGillen, and a succession of other detectives who inherited the case. Each brought their own perspective, their own theories, their own dedication. Each contributed something to the slowly accumulating understanding of what had happened to Joseph. Kelly pioneered the use of new technologies in the investigation, including early computerized facial reconstruction and database searching. McGillen coordinated the 1998 exhumation and the preservation of DNA evidence that would prove crucial. Others specialized in genealogical research, forensic analysis, or community outreach. The Vidocq Society, the organization of forensic experts that took on the case in 1998, contributed expertise that the police department lacked. Their profilers created psychological portraits of the likely perpetrator. Their forensic scientists analyzed evidence with techniques unavailable to the original investigators. Their members, many of whom were retired law enforcement, brought decades of experience to bear on the mystery. And then there was the DNA Doe Project, whose volunteers spent years building the family trees that finally led to Joseph's identification. These weren't professional investigators, but ordinary citizens who had learned genealogical research skills and wanted to use them for good. They worked without pay, often in their spare time, motivated by nothing more than a desire to help. One volunteer in particular deserves special mention, though I can't use her real name to protect her privacy. She was a retired school teacher from the Midwest who had become interested in genetic genealogy after using it to research her own family history. When she learned about the DNA Doe Project's work on unidentified decedents, she signed up immediately. For 3 years, this woman spent dozens of hours each week building family trees for the boy in the box case. She traced bloodlines back centuries, followed branches forward through multiple generations, and eliminated thousands of potential families from consideration. When leads dried up, she found new approaches. When theories failed, she started over. She never met Joseph. She had no connection to Philadelphia. She had no personal stake in the case beyond her own sense of justice. But she gave years of her life to finding his name, and without her work, he might still be unknown today. And there's something profound about this kind of dedication. In a world that often seems cynical and self-interested, the investigator's vigil reminds us that people will sacrifice their time, their energy, and their peace of mind for strangers they'll never meet. It reminds us that justice is not just an abstract concept, but a living commitment, carried forward by individuals who refuse to accept that some crimes are simply unsolvable. The vigil isn't over. Even with Joseph's identification, there's still work to be done. The investigation continues. The perpetrators, if any are still alive, remain uncharged. The full story of what happened to Joseph is still being pieced together. And there are thousands of other unidentified victims waiting for their own dedicated investigators. But for the men and women who worked the boy in the box case, December 2022 brought a measure of closure that had eluded them for so long. They could finally say the name of the child they had fought for. They could finally tell his story. They could finally honor their promise to find the truth. I've told you about genetic genealogy, but I want to go deeper into how this technology actually works, because it represents something remarkable. The ability to reach across time and give voice to the voiceless. Traditional DNA analysis, the kind you see on crime shows, works by comparing DNA profiles to databases of known individuals. If a suspect's DNA matches evidence from a crime scene, that's powerful proof of their involvement. But this approach requires that the relevant person's DNA already be in the database. If the killer has never been convicted of a crime, or if the victim has never been identified, traditional DNA analysis hits a wall. Genetic genealogy takes a different approach. Instead of looking for exact matches, it looks for partial matches, relatives who share some DNA with the person in question. The closer the relative, the more DNA they share. Parents and children share about 50% of their DNA. Siblings share about 50% on average. First cousins share about 12.5%, and so on, with the percentage decreasing as the relationship becomes more distant. The key insight is that even distant relatives, fourth or fifth cousins, who share less than 1% of their DNA, can provide a starting point for investigation. If you can find multiple distant relatives and determine how they're related to each other, you can start building a family tree. And if you build the tree far enough, you can identify the common ancestor whose descendants include both the known relatives and the unknown person. For the boy in the box case, this process took years. The DNA Doe Project's volunteers uploaded Joseph's DNA profile to public genealogy databases and searched for matches. They found dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of people who shared small amounts of DNA with him. Each match was a puzzle piece, but the puzzle had millions of pieces, and most of them didn't fit together. The volunteers focused on the strongest matches, people who shared enough DNA to be relatively close relatives, perhaps third or fourth cousins. They researched these matches, building family trees backward through generations, looking for common ancestors who could connect multiple matches. Genealogical research is painstaking work. Birth certificates, death certificates, marriage records, census data, military records, immigration records. All of these sources had to be consulted, cross-referenced, and verified. Many records from the early 20th century were incomplete, illegible, or simply lost. Family names changed through marriage or immigration. Dates were recorded inconsistently. Errors crept in and had to be corrected. Slowly, patterns began to emerge. Certain surnames appeared repeatedly in the family trees of DNA matches. Certain geographic areas kept coming up. Certain time periods showed clusters of births and marriages that suggested a common family. The volunteers built hypothetical family trees testing theories about how the DNA matches might be related. Most theories failed when contradicted by evidence, but gradually, the possibilities narrowed. The family that would eventually be identified as Joseph's emerged from the chaos of data, becoming clearer with each new piece of information. The final confirmation came when investigators obtained DNA samples from known members of the suspected family and compared them directly to Joseph's DNA. The match was definitive. Joseph Augustus Zarelli had been found. This technology has transformed cold case investigation. Since the Golden State Killer case in 2018, genetic genealogy has been used to identify hundreds of previously unknown victims and suspects. Cases that seemed hopelessly cold have been solved. Families that had given up hope have received answers. Justice that seemed impossible has become reality. But the technology also raises important ethical questions. When you submit your DNA to a genealogy service, you're not just sharing information about yourself. You're also sharing information about your relatives, including relatives you've never met and might not even know exist. Your decision to participate in genetic testing could eventually lead to a family member being identified in connection with a crime. The privacy implications are significant. Some people argue that genetic genealogy represents an unacceptable invasion of privacy, that our DNA should not be used for purposes we didn't explicitly consent to. Others argue that the benefits of solving crimes and identifying victims outweigh the privacy costs, that we have a collective interest in justice that supersedes individual privacy concerns. These debates will continue as the technology advances and its use becomes more widespread. What seems clear is that genetic genealogy is here to stay, that it will continue to transform how we investigate crimes and identify the unknown, and that society will need to develop frameworks for balancing its benefits against its risks. For Joseph Zarelli, these debates are academic. The technology worked. His name was found. His story can finally be told, and whatever we think about the broader implications of genetic genealogy, we can agree that this outcome was just. Why does it matter that we know Joseph's name? He's still dead. He was still murdered. His killer may never face justice. What difference does a name make? I've thought about this question a lot while researching this story, and I've come to believe that names are more important than we usually acknowledge. A name is not just a label, it's a connection to identity, to family, to history. It's an assertion that a person existed, that their life meant something, that they deserve to be remembered. For 65 years, the boy in the box was defined by his anonymity. His grave marker said, "America's unknown child." News articles referred to him as the unidentified boy, or simply the victim. He existed only as a question mark, a symbol of our collective failure rather than a person in his own right. Knowing his name changes everything. Joseph Augustus Zarelli was a specific individual with a specific history. He was born to specific parents on a specific date. He lived in specific places and had specific experiences. He was not just a symbol, but a human being, as real and complex as you or me. The name also connects Joseph to a larger story, the story of his family and his ancestors. The Zarelli name has its own history, its own meaning, its own place in the tapestry of American immigration and assimilation. Joseph was part of that story, even if his part was tragically brief. Knowing his name allows us to place him within that context, to understand him not as an isolated victim, but as someone connected to a broader community. And the name allows us to properly mourn Joseph. We can now visit his grave and address him by his true name. We can say prayers for Joseph Augustus Zarelli, not just for the unknown child. We can speak about him as a person, not just as a case file. And there's also a practical dimension to knowing Joseph's name. It allows investigators to focus their inquiry, to understand the specific circumstances that led to his death, to identify specific suspects. The anonymous investigation had been necessarily broad, considering any family that might have had a child matching Joseph's description. The identified investigation could be laser focused on Joseph's actual family and their actual circumstances. But beyond all these practical considerations, I think knowing Joseph's name matters because it affirms his dignity. Every person deserves to be known, to be acknowledged, to have their existence recognized by others. The anonymity imposed on Joseph by his killers was itself a form of violence, an attempt to erase him from history, to make his life and death meaningless. By finding his name, we reject that erasure. We insist that Joseph mattered, that his suffering was real, that his story deserves to be told. We push back against the forces of cruelty and indifference that tried to make him disappear. This is why the investigators worked so hard for so long. This is why the DNA Doe Project's volunteers spent years building family trees. This is why the announcement of Joseph's identity made international news. We understood collectively that giving him back his name was an act of redemption, a small but significant victory over the darkness that had claimed him. Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Say it again. Let it sink in. Remember it, because as long as we remember his name, he is not truly gone. He lives on in our memory, in our conscience, in our commitment to protecting the children who are still with us. As I write this, Joseph's case remains officially open. The Philadelphia Police Department continues to investigate, following leads that emerged from the identification, pursuing the possibility that someone might still be held accountable for his murder. The reality, as I've discussed, is the prosecution is unlikely. The people most likely to be responsible for Joseph's death are themselves almost certainly dead. The evidence that remains after 65 years, while sufficient to identify Joseph, may not be sufficient to prove criminal responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. The legal system, designed for timely prosecution, struggles with cases this old. But prosecution is not the only form of justice. There are other ways we can honor Joseph and respond to the crime committed against him. We can tell his story. We can make sure that Joseph is remembered not as the boy in the box, but as Joseph Augustus Zarelli, a child who deserved love and protection and received neither. We can ensure that his name is spoken, his photo is shared, his memory is kept alive. We can learn from his case. Joseph fell through the cracks of a system that should have protected him. By understanding how that happened, we can work to ensure it doesn't happen again. We can strengthen child protective services, improve reporting mechanisms, and create communities where children at risk are seen and helped. We can support the organizations that made Joseph's identification possible. The DNA Doe Project, the Vidocq Society, and similar organizations rely on donations and volunteers to continue their work. There are thousands of other unidentified victims waiting for the same kind of dedicated effort that Joseph received. We can also support broader reforms to prevent child abuse and neglect. Better mental health services for struggling parents. more resources for families in poverty, stronger connections between neighbors and communities, a culture that treats the welfare of children as a collective responsibility, not just a private family matter. These are the forms of justice we can give Joseph. Not punishment for his killers, perhaps, but something more enduring, a commitment to building a world where what happened to him cannot happen again. I want to share something with you. After researching this case for months, after reading thousands of pages of documents and watching hours of interviews, I feel like I know Joseph in a way I never expected. He has become real to me, not just a case study, but a person, and I find myself wanting to promise him something. Joseph, if somehow you can hear this, I promise that your story will be told. I promise that your name will be remembered. I promise that the suffering you endured will not be in vain, that it will motivate us to protect other children, that it will make us more vigilant, more compassionate, more committed to justice. That's a promise I can keep, and it's a promise I hope you'll join me in making. We've come to the end of Joseph's story, at least as far as we can tell it today, but in another sense, his story is just beginning. The identification that came in December 2022 was not an ending, but a new chapter, an opportunity to finally understand who Joseph was and what his life and death mean for us. Let me take you back to where we started, those cold winter woods near Susquehanna Road, where a cardboard box held the body of a little boy. Frederick Benosis, the young man who first discovered the body, ran away from what he found. He was scared, confused, unwilling to get involved. And while we can understand his reaction, we must also acknowledge that his silence extended Joseph's suffering, leaving him alone in the cold for several more days. We've all been Frederick Benosis at some point in our lives. We've all seen something wrong and looked away. We've all heard cries for help and found reasons not to respond. We've all chosen the comfort of ignorance over the burden of knowledge. Joseph's story challenges us to be different. It asks us to see the children around us, really see them, and to act when we sense that something is wrong. It asks us to overcome our fear and our inconvenience for the sake of the vulnerable. It asks us to be the person who stops, who looks, who makes the call. The detectives who worked Joseph's case over 6 decades modeled this kind of courage. Remington Bristow, William Kelly, Joseph McGillen, the Vidocq Society members, the DNA Doe Project volunteers, all of them chose to see Joseph when the world had forgotten him. They chose to act when action was inconvenient, costly, and seemingly hopeless. They chose to keep faith with a child they had never met, and their faith was rewarded. Joseph has his name. His grave bears his true identity. His story can finally be told in full. The promise they made to him, standing over his small body, has been kept. I promised you at the beginning of this story that there would be victory, and here it is. Not the victory we might have wanted, not a killer brought to justice or a child saved from death, but a quieter victory. The victory of memory over forgetting, of identity over anonymity, of truth over mystery. Joseph Augustus Zarelli lived for approximately 4 years. His life was marked by suffering we can barely comprehend. His death was violent, lonely, and cruel. But his legacy is something his killers could never have imagined. A story that has touched millions of people, that has inspired decades of dedication, that has pushed forward the boundaries of forensic science, and that has reminded us all of our responsibility to the children in our midst. In the end, Joseph's greatest gift to us is the question he forces us to ask. Who are the unknown children today? Who are the Josephs in our neighborhoods, our schools, our families? Who are the children falling through the cracks, unseen and unprotected? These children don't have to wait 65 years to be found. We can find them now. We can see them now. We can protect them now. All it takes is the courage to look, the willingness to act, and the faith that our efforts will make a difference. Joseph's grave at Ivy Hill Cemetery now bears his true name. Visitors leave flowers and toys, tokens of love for a child who received so little love in his life. The forensic sculptor's bust, once labeled Unknown Child, can now be identified as Joseph Augustus Zarelli. The case files that Detective Bristow maintained for decades now have a name on the cover. And somewhere in a laboratory or an archive or a detective's notes, the investigation continues. Because even with Joseph's name known, there is still work to be done. There are still questions to be answered. There is still, perhaps, justice to be served. But whatever happens with the investigation, Joseph has already won. He has won by being remembered. He has won by being named. He has won by mattering to millions of people who never knew him, but who refused to let him be forgotten. America's unknown child is unknown no more. Joseph Augustus Zarelli has come home. Rest in peace, Joseph. You are loved. You are remembered. You are ours. If this story moved you, please share it with others. Every share helps spread awareness about cold cases and missing children. Subscribe to this channel to follow more stories of justice delayed but not denied. And if you have information about any cold case, no matter how old, please contact your local authorities. It's never too late to make a difference. Joseph waited 65 years for his name. The next child shouldn't have to wait at all.